board the 1963 Lancia Flaminia 3B Coupe. This is a Pininfarina designed coupe. You could actually get 3 different coupe bodies on this car, plus a sedan, and there was an open version of one of them as well. This is one of my favorite cars, made by one of my favorite makes. It's kind of a weird car. If you don't know what Lancia is, they made rally cars, of course, starting in the 60s, and of course in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s with the Integrale. But before that, they made these incredibly well-engineered, really thoughtfully designed, high-quality cars. The best way I can describe it is to say that it makes a Ferrari or Alfa Romeo from the same era look a little bit kind of cheap and crappy. I know that's kind of a weird thing to say, but that's sort of Lancia's role here in the automotive world. It's a car that, objectively, you look at it and you think about the performance figures, and you're like, it's not really that remarkable. And it's a thing that you have to interact with the car and also have interacted with other Italian cars and non-Italian cars, for that matter, from the same era to really get what the Lancia of this era is all about. And of course, the way that it ended was that Lancia effectively almost went out of business and Fiat had to buy them in the late 60s. So it tells you a little bit about who was making decisions at Lancia, and it wasn't the accountants. And the cars are so much better for it nowadays. I mean, of course, we would like for them to have continued to exist. But what you get is a car that's really beautifully engineered and made, and everything about how you interact with it feels expensive. And it doesn't matter whether it's the way that the doors shut or the window winder feels, or you know, when you look at the technical details of the car, I mean, there's so much extraordinary stuff if you look under the hood. For example, this car is a 2.5-liter V6, mated to a 4-speed transaxle, which means it's mounted at the rear. And this technology, of course, was used by Formula 1 cars during that era. It was used by Ferrari, but after this car, I mean, Ferrari started doing it in the mid-60s for their road cars, and this car came out in the late 50s, and its predecessor, the Aurelia, had the same layout, which is this transaxle arrangement with inboard rear brakes. This car has disc brakes all around, and so there's a lot of sort of weird technical details also. For example, there are thermostatically controlled radiator blinds, and they stay closed when the thermostat is cold to warm up the engine more quickly, and then when it gets warm enough, then the thermostat opens, so you can get cooling only when you want it, and a faster warm-up. And there's all of this stuff in this car where you're just like, my god, the closer you look, the better it gets. And so the same thing applies when you're driving it. When you drive it, you're like, this feels like a piece of quality equipment. It doesn't have this quintessentially Italian fragile feel. In fact, it feels like an Italian Mercedes, I guess, is maybe a good way to put it. Athletic, not in this form. They made some athletic cars. The predecessor of this car, which is the Aurelia, did get second in the Mille Miglia behind a big Ferrari, despite having half the displacement, which is quite an achievement for an all-out competition event. And there were a lot of remarkable competition achievements. This is not a competition car. It is their flagship. They had a 3-model line in much the same way that BMW does now, or anyone else, of 3 different size cars, and this is the big one. This was the most luxurious Italian car that you could buy at the time. The overwhelming sensation that you get when you drive one of these cars is of quality and thoughtfulness of the design. It's a car that I don't think would be fully appreciated by someone unless they had some interest in technical content. It's not a kind of car for someone who just wants loud noises and sort of strong visual impact. That's kind of a Ferrari sort of thing. And this is more for someone who is really interested in all of the specific technical things that the engineers did. And of course, it makes nice noises. It's a V6. It should also be noted that the car that this replaced was the world's first V6, the Aurelia, and that is, one of the many technical innovations. I mean, they also Lancia made the first unitized chassis car in the 1920s, which is to say, it's not a separate frame. So in any case, the kind of person who buys this car is sort of a sophisticated person with some technical interest and really appreciates elegance and quality and isn't trying to impress anyone. This is not a car that you drive or own because you want other people to see you in it or know that you have one. Everyone reacts to this car by asking what it is, and if you know, you know. And the point of this car for these people is to have something that gives you this really gratifying sense of enjoyment when you interact with it, and appreciation for it, where you just say, man, I wish that if I were to design a car for myself, I would design it to do stuff like this. And they actually did, and sold them to the public, and now we have them existing and we can enjoy them, but it's not a car for everyone. I think you need to be of a certain mindset and have a certain level of appreciation for cars, and be sort of interested in how it makes you feel rather than how it makes other people feel. Despite the fact that these cars are quite rare and you don't come across them often in the United States especially, I have driven a fair number of them, and one of the things that's important to note about Lancias generally is that because they have a lot of sort of unusual technical solutions, it's important to buy a really well looked after example. Because if they're looked after by someone who doesn't appreciate or understand the complexities of the cars, then they can be sort of cantankerous and sort of not operate properly. And this particular car is probably one of the best, if not the best, Flaminias that I've ever driven in terms of how it functions. And that's a reflection of the people who have looked after it. There have been a couple of specialists who are really well known in the area who look after these cars and know how they work and know the kind of massaging and finessing that they need. And it's a car that when fully dialed is just an absolute pleasure to interact with. And when it's not, it's kind of frustrating because there are these sort of mystifying problems that can be a little bit difficult to isolate if you don't know what you're doing. One of the biggest things that happens with these cars, which is common with a lot of transaxle cars, is that you get sort of mysterious driveline vibrations, which are the result of the drive shaft spinning at engine speed rather than road speed. This car has none of that, but if you have someone who knows these cars really well, they are just an absolute pleasure to drive and enjoy. It is very much a connoisseur's car. It is a car for the sophisticated enthusiast who is not necessarily interested in outright performance or impact or sort of extroversion. It's a car for the thinking man, and often that's how these cars were sort of positioned or presented, was for the thinking man who really gets what the appeal of these cars is. And that's certainly true of the Flaminia. I would say the smaller cars, like the Fulvia, were used very successfully for rallying, and of course this is the company that ultimately made the Stratos, and so they obviously had that capability as well. But the Flaminia is a very sophisticated, elegant car for someone who just really likes cars. You know, there are people who like cars, there are people who like driving, there are people who like both, and I think that this is a car for someone who really has to appreciate both of them.